My dad was born in Sweden, 1886. Came over as a young child with 4 older sisters, and he had 4 younger sisters. He was the only boy in the family. They came to Jamestown. His father, I believe, was organist for the first Lutheran church. My dad never talked about my father at all. I assume that's the only work that he did, was the organist. I'm not sure. He may have had an alcohol problem, because my dad never touched alcohol at all. They lived initially southeast of Falconer. My dad's sisters worked in the worsted mills in Falconer. I suppose probably 12 years old they started. I remember my dad talking about he would take his sisters up to work. They had a horse and a buggy, and my dad would fall asleep on the way back, and the horse found its way. They also lived on the south side of Jamestown, and then down by the Chautauqua River, about where the power plant is now. He was an outdoorsman with 8 sisters. I'm sure he was out of the house all the time. So he was very active trapping, hunting, fishing.
So 8 sisters and him? So
That's
he's
right.
The only boy?
Only boy.
Wow. What about your mother?
My mother was, her maiden name was Boak, B-O-A-K. She was born in Jamestown, 96. The family came from Canada, and the story is that they packed up the whole farm, all the cattle. They came to Moon Station over near Sinclairville, and they drove the cattle all the way up Town Line Road near what is now the Salisbury Road. Supposedly they bought the farm sight unseen. All the property slopes towards the north, so it was always late getting the crops in, late getting the crops out. On the corner of Salisbury Road and Town Line Road was a schoolhouse, and my Aunt Hattie, who was older, and my mother taught at the schoolhouse. They both had gone to Fredonia Normal. My Aunt Hattie went on and taught at North Main Street School. The building is still there outside of Jamestown. And then she became business teacher at Jamestown. My mother taught on the East Side School, which JCC has had. My folks married in 1927. Prior to that, my dad had bought at Lakeside Drive in Venus Point right after World War I in 1918. Now, my dad had bought a farm adjacent to where my mother lived, and this was to sort of exempt him from the draft for World War I. So right after the war, he started at Bemis. And at that time, the property had been purchased by John O. Johnson. And in the article in the paper, it listed it was 2 cottages, 20-some rowboats from a boat livery, and a bait pond. My dad built addition to the building that John O. Johnson had built a building in between the 2 cottages. John O. Johnson he was a boat builder. Actually, he had been foreman, I think, at Journal Press, and he had been a commissioner on the Chautauqua Lake Navigation Commission. John O. Johnson had built several boats and raced them, and he apparently died on a hunting trip. And my dad had purchased the building from the bank.
What drew your dad to the lake?
Probably he'd always been out hunting, fishing, trapping. He had enlisted in the Navy when he was very young, and when they gave him the various shots, he almost died, and they mustered him out of the Navy, which is probably the best thing that ever happened. He always had a canoe. He was always involved with a hunting camp down towards Warren, just about on the state line. I remember he talked about one winter he and a friend were taking a canoe down the outlet to go to the hunting camp, and they came around a bend, and there was a log or a tree across the creek, and they tipped over. They salvaged everything, lit a fire, dried everything out, and went on. So that was typical of him. He liked boats, he liked the water, and I think he was on the farm mainly just to prevent going to the war. And this opportunity came up for him to buy. So
he buys the Lakeside Drive 1918, and at that time, was there also automobiles part of that business, or did that come up a little later?
John O. Johnson built this building between the 2 cottages that were there. The upper part was a garage, and the lower part was boat storage. And they had a marine railway to get the boats out of the water. The upper part where the garage was, the local people that had a car brought their car in every night, and in the wintertime the cars were put up on blocks.
So it was just storage. They didn't do any maintenance there or any servicing?
I don't know how much he did on maintenance. Yeah. This was a time that the internal combustion engines were being improved all the time. So he probably was involved in doing some of that. My dad, he serviced the automobiles, he serviced the boats. There was a gas pump, hand gas pump, up on Lakeside Drive, and he always talked about he had to carry gasoline down to the boats.
Was your mother involved in the business?
Well, they weren't married until 1927, so initially, no, it was one of my dad's sisters helped out, and somewhere in the 20s, my dad built the, added on out over the lake, built additional storage, a workshop, and in the upper area was a boat shop.
What was a normal, did you talk about what the kind of a normal boat traffic, what did the lake look like? What kind of boats were on the lake in the late 20s?
Well, probably going back before that, it was just strictly steamboats from, say, the mid-1800s on up until early 1900s. And these were commercial boats servicing the various hotels and the 2 or 3 parks on the lake. And they provided transportation on the lake from the railroads to the hotels. The roads were poor, so this was the best type of transportation. In those days, and really up through the 40s even, people from Pittsburgh, especially Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Buffalo, would bring their families to the hotel for the summer, and then they would commute back and forth on the trains, say from Pittsburgh to Mayville or Jamestown, and then take the steamboats to the various hotels. The only private boats, at least until the late 1800s, were rowboats and sailboats. And most of the rowboats were what we called double-end rowboats, pointed on both ends. And they were used for trolling for muskellunge, fishing muskellunge. In the 1900s, early 1900s, as the motors became more powerful, then there became more private boats. And by 1906, we found in the Jamestown Journal a listing of boats that had been registered on Chautauqua Lake. Now, they started registering the boats in 1900, and we now have a boat that was built before 1906.
How did they register them? Were they based on length, displacement, engine size?
Initially, the listing in the paper had them by tons. Now, what type of ton is, I don't know. There are various tons, like 2,000 pounds, but tons was also used as a volume, which would indicate the displacement. The listing is sort of, in later years we found more listings, but if somebody did not renew his registration number, they reused that number. So this boat that we have is registered as 144. Now, this raised a question with me. In 1906, where we had 110 boats registered, and we didn't have any docks to keep the boats at, because the only docks were the big, what we call steamboat docks, to handle the steamboats. There's one at the end of Main Street in Bemis Point for years.
So in 1918, when your dad bought the John O. Johnson, were there dock space there for private boats to get to?
Yes, there was. We have photos of, the photos were taken of the steamboats coming and going from the steamboat dock at the end of Main Street. But in the foreground, it shows the motor launches at the dock.
Was the business successful? Did your dad find this more of a hobby? I mean, that was his living, right? I mean, that was his full-time job.
It was his full-time job. I don't think he was not a businessman. Making money other than making the business work and living. Making money wasn't important to him. He wanted to work on boats and take care of the boats for his customers.
So you, essentially, though, you were born in 1933, and born in Bemis Point, you were living in Bemis Point at the time?
I was born in Jamestown, but in 1929, my dad and mother bought property down at the Jamestown City line.
Okay, that's right.
And this, on the north side, was a house and barn farm. And on the other side of what was Route 17, I guess, was the outlet. And this was an area where in previous years they'd hauled out steamboats to repair them.
Now, is that at the area now, which was the LS Aero Marine on the outlet, that area?
Yes. Now, my dad had just expanded in 1929, and he built facilities to haul out boats up to 8 tons, and he built a shop there. And I assume, well, he'd become a dealer for Chris Craft in the mid-20s, about 1926. Things went well then, and so he had to expand. So that's why he bought down at Jamestown. But I assume he had financial problems, and at that time he was doing business with First National Bank, whose president was Ralph Sheldon. Ralph Sheldon Jr. had polio as a child. He had interest in airplanes, and I assume Mr. Sheldon was happy to provide capital for my dad, and Ralph Sheldon Jr. became a partner with my dad.
Was Sheldon active in the business, or was he sort of the financing part of it?
No, he was never active in the business. No. And so during the 30s, my dad started to buy Mr. Sheldon out.
So when you're born into this business, was that something that you have recollection of being part of it, the daily go down to your dad's shop and be working on engines or looking at engines or being part of that? Was that part of your world?
Well, I was always trailing my father around, and the mechanics and whoever else was working. So that was my life, starting out from when I was a toddler, I guess. You know, I've been told of how many times I fell in the lake, just just trying to get out of the way that they were working. So I was very fortunate. We were always there, 7 days a week in the summertime. And initially, we stayed there all the time until after World War II. Customers discovered that my dad was there, so 2 o'clock in the morning they'd come rapping on the door and want some gasoline.
Now, when you say there, was this at Bemis Point or down at Jamestown?
This is Bemis Point.
Okay.
So the summers we were at Bemis Point from May until into September or October. So I started school at Bemis Point because we were still living there at that time. And Bemis Point had consolidated, become a central school district a couple years before. But in the wintertime, we lived right there at the city line at Jamestown, just outside of Jamestown. So I had to ride the school bus. Well, for 13 years, I rode a school bus to Bemis Point. Now, my sister went to, for the first 6 years, she went to Flavanna School. And when I started riding the school bus, they still had the schools at, well, West Oak Hill, Flavanna, Bellevue, Ellery Center, and there may have been one at West Ellery.
Do you remember December 7th, 1941?
Very well. It was, it had been a very warm period from Thanksgiving to December 7th, and we had been collecting ground pine and cutting branches, pine branches and spruce branches up on my dad's farm. And he had just purchased a 1941 Chrysler New Yorker. It was a used one. And it had a very good radio in it. And we were coming back home and had the radio on when we heard about the events at Pearl Harbor.
Did you get a sense, did your dad, mom react to it? Now, I realize you're not even close to being draft eligible, but family, friends, was there a buzz shortly thereafter? Did you notice any sort of change in kind of community attitudes? I realize you're only 8.
I don't think any of us really knew where Pearl Harbor was. And I wasn't old enough to realize the extent of it. But I had 2 uncles. One was very much pro-Roosevelt, one was very much anti-Roosevelt. And every time we had a family get-together, they went at it for a while. And so there was much talk about that beforehand, and then of course during the war. No, I didn't get a feeling of that. I remember going with my dad down to probably Clark Hardware Company It was on 3rd Street. And he was talking with somebody very seriously about it, but we didn't have anybody really close that was in the armed forces. One of my dad's sister's husband was a chief in the Navy, and one of my cousins was my aunt and uncle worked in the Panama Canal Zone. So there was talk about it, but it really didn't register with me that much.
Do you have recollections of VJ Day?
VJ Day, I was working the dock. 1945. During the whole war, 42, 43, 44, there were no boats put in the water. And so we stayed in Jamestown all the time. In 45, as I recall, you could get I think it was 5 gallons of gas for an outboard motor a month, and 10 gallons of gas for an inboard motor for a month. So there were a few boats in the water. The gasoline, as I recall, the only thing that we were able to get was 100 octane aviation gas, which was clear. But I was working the dock. We didn't have that many customers, but we had somebody came in that he had a radio in his car, and he'd heard about VJ Day just before he left. He came over to get gas.
Did you go downtown? Was there any celebration? Do you remember? I've read about it, but I wondered if you were part of that. Did your dad take you down there at all?
No, not at all. I don't. I suppose the fire whistle blew in Bemis. I don't remember that. But going back to World War I, my dad talked about he was of course on the farm, and he was carrying a canoe down to the Cattaraugus Creek, or Cassadaga Creek, I should say, and he heard the church bells ringing. So he knew that was the end of World War I.
November 11th, 1918, yeah, 11/11/11.
Yes.
High school, you graduated from Bemis Point?
Yes.
And then what drew you to the Webb Institute of Naval Architecture and Marine Engineering?
I was fortunate to read an article in the Saturday Evening Post about it. I was a senior, had no idea what I wanted to do, or what I was going to do. My sister had gone to Cornell. She graduated in '46. I was 5 years behind her. So when I started at Bemis Point, there were 3 of us that went through almost all high school, and we were very competitive. And so I was fortunate that we had good grades, and I was able to qualify to go to Webb, which they specialized in naval architecture, marine engineering, Webb was started by William Webb, who was a shipbuilder on Lower Manhattan. In 1886, he established a retirement home for shipbuilders and also an academy for ship design and naval architecture. This was in the Bronx, right, just north of Manhattan. And after World War II in '46, Webb moved out to one of the Pratt estates on the North Shore of Long Island at Glen Cove. And this was the occasion for the story about the Webb Institute. So I was accepted, a small school. We had 16 in our graduating class. It was just the type of thing that worked out well for me.
And part of that, you had a chance to work at a Chris-Craft plant.
One of the things that Webb had was a 10-week work period between semesters. In the freshman year, we worked at New York Naval Shipyard in Brooklyn as 5 weeks welding school and 5 weeks as apprentice machinists. Sophomore year, we went on board various ships as what they called engine cadets, learning about the engineering of the ships. I went to Germany, made 2 trips to Germany. In my junior year, I asked for a job at Chris-Craft at Algonac, and I got it. And I was very fortunate. I worked about over half the time on the production line, building a 53-foot. Well, we started about three or four 53-foot Chris-Crafts. And in the senior year, I worked at Bethlehem Steel Shipbuilding in Quincy, Mass., south of Boston. That's where I determined that I wasn't going to sit in an office for the rest of my life.
Going back, your dad's business included dealership with Chris-Craft, and do you aware, I mean, I'm sure you're aware, but what was going on in Falconer at that time? Ed Ward's written up stories about Chris-Craft manufacturing in Falconer. Was that part of your world?
Yes, and whenever I had a chance, whenever my dad went down to the factory, I went with him. I assume my dad had something to do with the coming to Jamestown. Chris-Craft, during World War II, as they could see the end of the war coming, they were looking to expand, and they had got an option on a piece of property outside of Falconer in '44, somewhere in there. So even before the war ended, they had already purchased the property and started building. So the first boats came out of there. Well, my dad got 2 boats, I know, in November and December of '45. I didn't see that much of the plant because we always were in the office or at the tail end of the plant. But my dad would always, he'd go down there all the time, and he'd bring home 5-gallon buckets of screws that had been dropped on the floor that were swept up. So I spent many evenings with screws all over the floor sorting them out. And then I vaguely recall, I think the first 16-foot that came off the line, they brought up to the Bemis Point place, and it was launched and they test ran out there.
Back to your career, then you, after you got done with the Webb, were commissioned as an ensign in 1955. Did you think you were going to be, that Navy career was going to be part of your career?
No, that was one of the things that evolved was all during my going to Webb. The Korean War was going on. And the draft board was breathing down my neck. I had to take an exam each year, and you had to be supposed to be at least in the top half of your class to get an exemption. My senior year, we were working up at Bethlehem Steel, and we went up to Boston and applied for Officer Candidate School. And it ended up I was accepted. I graduated on a Saturday and went to Officer Candidate School the next day. I had very good experiences in the Navy. They gave me excellent training, a lot of responsibility, and very good jobs. But I could see it wasn't the type of thing, a career for me. It did turn out I stayed in the reserves for 32 years. But my folks were getting up in age, and they were anxious to have me come back home.
Any stories you want to talk about during that 3-year period? You were assigned to the San Diego with the Amphibious Indoctrination School, San Francisco for the ABC Warfare School, Atomic, Biological, Chemical Warfare. Anything you want to talk about here? Anything we can talk about after 50 years?
Well, I can give you a lot of sea stories, but initially, the first ones that you mentioned were they were school training. So after Officer Candidate School, I had a month at Amphibious Indoctrination School, and then I had 8 or 10 weeks at San Francisco at Treasure Island for damage control school and the Atomic, Biological, and Chemical Warfare Defense School. And then I went to, my first ship was a landing ship dock out of San Diego. We went initially to Hawaii for amphibious operation. And when we came back, then we went to Seattle and then on north off of Alaska for, we're resupplying the whole year's supply to each of the radar stations off the various points off Alaska. We made 3 trips to Alaska, coming back to Seattle each time. And we carried 3 Army landing craft utilities, LCUs, to each of these radar stations. And we would launch them. They would go to an accompanying cargo ship, unload the cargo that went to that radar station. There was no dock. You just ran on the beach. So that's why they used the landing craft. So the whole year's supply for that radar station went then. And then we would reload the LCUs and go on to the next radar station. And the last trip up there. We took Air Force dependence vehicles up to Whittier, Alaska, and unloaded them. After we came back, the ship was put out of commission, and I was transferred to a sister ship as chief engineer. Previously, I'd been damage control assistant and division officer for repair and auxiliary equipment.
You talk about Alaska during that time period. This is the right Cold War. Things are happening. Alaska's, as we know, not just a shot away from Russia. Was that, again, part of what was going on there in the Navy?
We weren't aware of it. We came within 30 miles of Russia. But, we got almost to the Arctic Circle, not quite. We sat out a blizzard there for 2 days sitting off a point, I can't remember the name, but the only thing that did happen there, we were out 30 days at a time, never got ashore. Well, I take that back. We went ashore once in Nome, and there was nothing there except a couple bars, I guess. But Russia put up Sputnik, and maybe twice a week we would get a little bit of a paper that the radio men had copied as to what the world's news was going on.
So you knew about Sputnik?
Yes.
What was the reaction that was massive.
Again, we really didn't realize what was going on, I don't think. We were more concerned about what we had to do that day and what the event was, ballasting down. One thing that did happen on the second cruise up there was we had a new engineering officer on board, came on board, and he was stepping from the crane. We had two cranes, one on either side of the ship, and we had a well deck where we took the ship with the smaller boats, the LCUs on board. But there'd been a problem on the crane, and they required that the captain and the engineering officer inspect that. Well, the engineering officer was stepping from the crane to the the helicopter deck, and he slipped and fell about 30. Yeah, thank you. He slipped and fell about 30 feet to the well deck below, and he was pretty badly banged up, of course. We did have a corpsman on board, and he, anyway, we got the engineering officer up to the sick bay, and they called in for something to get him out of there. They brought in a float plane, and we were in Bristol Bay at the time, and we ballasted down and dropped down the gate at the stern of the ship, so it made a dock for the plane to come up to. Loaded the engineering officer on the plane on a stretcher, and we had a doctor on board. had just come on board also. And he was seasick before we even left the pier. But anyway, so the doctors thought this is a good chance for him to get off of the ship. So the doctor and the engineering officer and the pilot and the co-pilot, they were all in the plane, and the plane goes down and starts to take off, and it caught a wing and flipped. Everybody got out except the engineering officer. So that was probably the major experience that we found.
Had you been receiving inquiries from your mom and dad about coming home?
Oh yes.
So they wanted you home?
Yes. Yeah.
And at what point did you say, okay, you win? I'm not sure.
Oh, I can't say. After I was on the two ships, well, when I signed out at Officer Candidate School, I had applied for engineering duty only type of designation because of my college experience. They did not have any billets open at that time, so I went on active duty as a straight line officer. And they said, once you get out to your first duty station, call your detail officer. He's the one that assigns where you go, and request a change of designator. And every time I came back from Alaska to Seattle, I'd get to the phone and call the detail officer and remind him about that. So on my second ship, I was engineering officer. Well, from the first ship, it was going out of commission, and I was the only one on the ship that didn't have orders to someplace else. And finally, they came through, and they transferred me to this other landing ship dock as engineering officer, and I was still an ensign. The engineering officer on that ship is a lieutenant's billets. So that was unheard of when I reported on board. But then the ship went through several amphibious exercises, and then we went to Bremerton, Washington for overhaul. This would be in July and August of '57. So I was in charge of the overhaul for the ship at Bremerton in '57, and we came back to Long Beach, and then we went to San Diego for what they called underway training, which was preparing. You had about half the crew was new, so you had to retrain them, and we were getting ready to go to the Western Pacific to sort of cruise the Formosa Straits, patrolling there at that time. And we were in San Diego for repairs, and the ship superintendent in San Diego comes on board and wants to know who, at that time I was Lieutenant J.G., wanted to know who Lieutenant Lawson was. They had advanced orders for me to go to San Diego repair facility. The repair facility was a small shipyard, and so that's what happened. And at that, well, prior to that, the detail officer had told me the only place that was available was to go to Subic Bay in the Philippines. And I wasn't about to go there at that time. So, and about that time, my dad wrote a letter, which he'd never done before. So that's how I came home.
You come home in 1957 then?
No, November '58.
58. What did your dad hope for you to do? Were you going to be a partner with him? Were you going to just be the son? Did he have an expectation as to that you would be taking over the business?
He said, "It's all yours. I'm just going down to the shop and work."
Ah, that's simple, huh? Congratulations. Were you ready for that? Did you mentally ready to saying, all right, I guess this is mine?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I spent, 17 years observing him, so. The business had changed somewhat. In the 50s, was sort of the boom years of boats. The boats became within reach of more people. So, and the changeover to fiberglass was coming. The outboard motors were getting bigger.
How did you adapt to that? Did you see it coming ahead of time, or was it sort of reactionary as your customer base was looking for more fiberglass, outdoor motors? Or did you feel like you were ahead of the curve and say, here's something we should go to?
I don't think I thought about it. Yeah. No, you're so busy. Yes, you had salesmen coming through, and we'd always go to the New York Boat Show in January. And at that time, you'd see the new products coming out. And so probably the boat shows were things that determined what you did, what you bought. That was one thing my dad was very, very good at anticipating, seeing something and realizing that's going to take off. That was the case with Chris Craft. So he was a Chris Craft dealer from probably 26 somewhere in there. Actually, he was a Chris Craft dealer before it was Chris Craft Corporation. It was Smith and Sons.
In addition to Chris Craft, what other kind of major brands did you deal?
Oh, probably Johnson Motors was the next one. And then over the years we had Old Town. You'd had Old Town canoes for years. And then there were various we had Lyman for a short while.
Do you have Grumman?
Had Grumman for years, right from the start. And initially it was Grumman. When I was at Webb the freshman year, we went to the Grumman plant on Long Island, and to see him building the Grumman canoes, and the line of canoes was here, and over there were the airplanes that they were building, Grumman airplanes. They were using, right after World War II, all the manufacturers were looking for new uses for their technology. And this was the case with Grumman. And Grumman they were put together the same way as the airplanes were put together. And then Grumman eventually came up to it was an ice skate plant in Marathon here in central New York. We had Glass Bar. They were early good fiberglass boats. can't think what else now. We had various ones, aluminum boats, and then we had slips of mind.
You were a full-service operation, though. I mean, right? You sold, you serviced, you gas. I mean, you soup to nuts, didn't you?
Yes, we did everything. Actually, my dad did everything. He even did upholstery work, canvas work. He did all the woodworking.
Yeah.
He usually had a mechanic, and I was very fortunate. We had 3 good mechanics in my lifetime.
Want to name them?
Let's see if it was Chet Frost, Clarence Hansen, and Bruce Ayresman. Bruce was with me from 68 to he died in 2015.
Now, Ned Ward was telling me that he actually used to hang around there as sort of a boat rat. Is that right?
Yes, I think most of the local boys did. My dad, again, he liked to have them around. He's very willing to have them, trail them around and try to show them things, how to do things.
Yeah, Ned said in a note to me, he goes, long before I could be hired, I hung around Ellis Aero Marine, and at the end of the day, David would take me with him to my grandfather's ice cream parlor to treat me to a cone for the work of the day. And his favorite flavor was, what do you think he said your favorite flavor was?
I don't know, if he's talking about me, it should be vanilla.
Okay, he said maple walnut.
Well, yeah, that too.
Okay. Just checking his, he's a writer, you know? They take liberties.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
And he mentioned,
Well, I was in the Navy for most of the time that he was around.
Okay.
Old enough. But.
so it might have been referencing your dad.
But he's right. We would hire the kids for working the dock and cleaning the boats and whatever else we had. And if they showed interest and were inclined, then they'd work down at Jamestown, at painting and varnishing and whatever else.
You also talked about the best motorman employed there was a guy named Clarence Hansen, who you mentioned, and that he would grind valves by hand using a stick with a small suction cup on the end.
That was the final finishing of the grinding. Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
How did it work?
It was just a stick with a suction cup on the end of it, and he had his rhythm down. That as to how he did it. He'd do it a little bit, and then he'd lift it up. And well, between this, you had the valve, and that went down into the valve seat, and you'd put some grinding compound on the face of the valve, and then do maybe a third of it, and then turn it around and do another third. But Clarence had it down to a sort of a science.
Well, it certainly was remembered and reflected here.
But Clarence and his father was a blacksmith, and he did much of the plumbing in Bemis Point. And Clarence and his father had a Ford dealership in Bemis Point, if you can believe that. And their garage was where the Bemis Point Library is now.
as you, I mean, you're just so associated with the Bemis Point, and for so many years, David, you saw from when you came back in '58 till the time when you sort of ceased operations, what was the big change? Where did you see the evolution of the boat service business?
What time period now?
Well, you came back in '58.
Between when I was
Yeah, when you're running the ship, when you're literally running the ship.
Outboard motors,
Yeah.
increase in horsepower, fiberglass boats, these are outboards. And at that time, they came through just bare hull, and you had to order and install windshields, lights, steering, controls, just about everything except a bare boat. Almost no trailers. Trailers were just coming out. So probably, to answer your question, the development of trailing boats. Up until that time, most people had a cottage on the lake. And going back even farther, before World War II, they were mostly very well-to-do people that had there were summer homes, but big homes on the lake.
What did trailering boats do for your business? I visualize, the days where you had a cottage and you had the boat, you're on the lake. I mean, the boat's in that lake, Chautauqua Lake, all the time. And if you have to service it, you take it up to LS Aero Marine or others that are on the lake. But all of a sudden, you get a trailer, you can pull it out and go elsewhere.
That really didn't affect us that much, other than it created more of a peak season for us. But even up until later years now, the boats that we sold, especially the inboards, and this is what we always liked. We liked the inboards better than the outboards or inboard outboards. But the boats that we sold, we launched them in the springtime, serviced them as they needed to be serviced. They went to the individuals' homes in front of whether there's a buoy or a dock. And well, the season was basically Memorial Day to Labor Day. And then Labor Day, everybody came back in, brought their boats in. We hauled the boats out, put them in storage, worked on them during the wintertime if they needed any work on them, and then launched them in the springtime. The trailer people, the only time you saw them was if they wanted winterizing of the motor, or if they had a breakdown in the summertime. So there's a peak need for mechanical work during the summertime, and then you didn't have work for him during the wintertime unless they were willing to do refinishing and painting and varnishing, that type of thing.
Did you do that part of your business down in Jamestown?
Mostly, yes.
So what was the division of work between the two locations when you had the Bemis Point and you also had the Flavanna Avenue properties?
Initially, well, for many years it was Jamestown from late November to, well, probably Memorial Day. And then Bemis Point from Memorial Day up until we got the boats out. And we usually try to get everything cleaned up by Halloween.
Do you recall steamers?
Yes, City of Jamestown. Yeah, that's the only one that went in my lifetime. It was always nice to hear the whistle as it's coming through the ferry. And I don't remember much before World War II about steamboats. I remember them coming over, and well, my mother took photos of me. I was allowed to row between our dock and what we call the steamboat dock at Main Street, but I couldn't go out beyond the end of the dock. But so the photos of me with our dog Trixie, which was a Springer Spaniel that I grew up with. We'd row all day back and forth between the docks, and the steamboats would come in there. After World War II, the steamboats didn't run that much.
At some point, you sort of decide that you're going to kind of shut down the business. Was that a hard decision for you?
No, I don't think it was a hard decision. It was inevitable. My folks had died, and then my sister had a stroke, and then she died in 2001. No, it was inevitable. Something had to be done. And it was, and the taxes were on a lakeside property was getting so high that I didn't have income to support it, and it was either going to be a restaurant or condominiums, and I didn't like either one of them. And I was very fortunate to have a group of, I think it was about 8 friends and customers and members of the Antique and Classic Boat Club come to me with the suggestion for a museum.
So what do you think? They take you out for dinner. I read a little bit about this, and they sit you down for dinner, and they come up with this concept of you donating the facility to a museum to be formed. What was your emotions at the time?
Oh, I thought it was a good idea. Yeah. The only question I had was, how are we going to do it? Where were we going to get the funds to do it? The building needed a lot of work. And I had no idea that it was ever going to be as successful as it is.
Last time I saw you, David, I brought in some family and friends, and you were there. You were the docent giving the tour. Do people appreciate the sense of history they have when they have the privilege of you giving them a tour?
Oh, I think they do. I don't think I'm not sure they consider it a privilege. But
I do.
It's a privilege for me to do it. I enjoy it.
Are you surprised with it's expanded, the number of boats that have been donated? It's quite a facility.
Yes, and the educational part of it, we have, I think it was about 8 fourth grade classes come through this last year.
What's the question I should be asking you, Dave, that I haven't?
I don't know.
Craig, is there one saying, Greg, I hope he gets to it, and he hasn't yet?
No, I've been very fortunate to have very good people, volunteers throughout the years. Been the right mix. That's led to the success. I'm sorry, my sister, my mother and father can't see it. My sister is the one that, she was the artist or the one in the family that was more interested in the museum type of things. Well, we have a collection of anchors that she collected. And she'd been active in Fenton with photographs.
The name outside the building is L.S. Aero Marine. I assume the L is Lawson.
S is Sheldon.
Sheldon, Aero Marine, okay.
Yeah. The Aero, I always was under the impression that came from Sheldon, but I'm not sure that that's true or not. The one thing is that in reviewing the corporation papers, they covered just about everything you could think of, which included airplanes, float planes. In 1930, when this was drawn up, float planes were popular in the area, and so they didn't know what was going on. The only thing that I see that they did not cover was they did not cover boat trailers.
They probably didn't exist then, did they?
No.
I got to tell you, Dave, this has been a hoot for me. My wife found it very fascinating that I'd be interviewing you today because she's the boat person. And she therefore assumes that I'm not a boat person. She goes, how could you even communicate with Dave Lawson because you're not a boat person? You put a key in the ignition and hopefully it works. You know, so I'm thrilled. You've educated me, and this has been an incredible afternoon. So I'm so glad you shared this.
No, thank you.